The Galactic Concord had ruled the stars for 12,000 years, and in all that time they had never once considered that the youngest species among them would be the ones to walk. Away First Ambassador Alira Voss stood at the center of the Grand Assembly Hall and looked up at the towering figures that surrounded her on every side. Knowing that this would be the last time she would ever stand in this place, the Vorathi delegates sat in their massive chairs carved from the bones of conquered worlds, and their four eyes barely glanced in her direction as she prepared to speak. Crystalline Selthari hummed with a low frequency that Alira had learned long ago was their way of expressing boredom and contempt for those they considered beneath them. 347 species filled this hall, and humanity had been the youngest and smallest among them for 80 long years. Alira cleared her throat and activated the translation matrix that would carry her words to every corner of the chamber. The United Earth Federation formally withdraws from the Galactic Concord effective immediately, she announced, and her voice did not waver, even as she felt the weight of history pressing down upon her shoulders. She had expected outrage or perhaps even threats of retaliation, but what she received was something far worse. Silence, High Arbiter. Kethal of the Vorathi slowly blinked his four eyes and tapped one massive claw against his armrest before responding in a tone that dripped with dismissal. Acknowledged, and your departure is noted. That was it, and those four words summarized everything that humanity had meant to the Concord for 8 decades of service and sacrifice. Alira thought about the human soldiers who had died fighting in Concord wars on distant worlds, and she thought about the engineers who had kept alien ships running and the diplomats who had worked tirelessly to bridge gaps between species that had hated each other for millennia, all of it dismissed with a single word. She turned to leave, and her footsteps echoed through the vast chamber as delegates from 100 worlds returned to their conversations as if she had never been there at all. Near the exit, she passed Councillor Dreven of the Selthari, and the crystalline being shifted his form to block her path. A wise decision, little mammal, Dreven said, and his mandibles clicked together in what served as a smile among his kind. You were never meant to sit among gods, and it is good that you finally understand your place in the natural order of things. Alira stopped, and for a long moment she simply looked at the ancient being who had lived for 3,000 years and who had seen empires rise and fall like waves upon a shore. We are taking him with us, she said quietly, and watched as the colors in Dreven's crystalline body shifted from smug purple to alarmed orange. You should know that you cannot do this, Dreven hissed, and his form flickered with agitation. The prisoner belongs to the Concord, and he is our responsibility to contain and study for the safety of all species. He is human, Alira replied, and her voice had turned cold as ice on a dead world. His name is Marcus Cole, and you have kept him in a black site prison for 60 years, without trial or charge, and we found out everything. You do not understand what he is or what he represents. Dreven protested, and for the first time, Alira heard something like fear in his voice. The artifact changed him and made him into something dangerous beyond your comprehension. Then you should have told us, Alira said, and she stepped around the counselor without looking back. But you did not, because you never thought we were worth telling anything to, and now we are taking our people home across the galaxy. The great exodus had already begun, and human ships of every size and purpose were lifting off from 1,000 worlds on the trading hub of Nexus Prime. The human merchants closed their shops and packed their goods while their alien customers watched in confusion. Where are you going? Asked a young Vorathi trader who had grown up buying Earth coffee from old Samuel Chun. Home, Samuel replied as he loaded the last crate onto his shuttle. We are all going home on the border fortress of Station Kappa 7. The human security forces handed over their posts to bewildered Concord replacements who had never learned how. The systems actually worked. Commander Yuki Tanaka saluted the Selthari officer who had come to take her place and then led her people to the waiting transport ships. "They will not last a month without us," whispered Lieutenant Park as they boarded. "That is not our problem anymore," Yuki replied, but she felt a heaviness in her chest because she had spent 15 years protecting people who had never once said thank you. In the medical stations and the research labs and the engineering bays of countless Concorde installations, humans quietly gathered their things and said goodbye to colleagues who only now seemed to realize how much they had depended on the small soft creatures they had always dismissed. Them aliens watched the humans leave with relief and muttered about finally being rid of the primitives who had somehow wormed their way into Concorde society. Others watched with growing unease as they realized just how many critical systems had human fingerprints on them. Within 30 standard days, not a single human remained in Concorde space, and the galaxy that had barely noticed their arrival 80 years ago barely noticed their departure now. But deep in the classified files of Concorde intelligence, there was a name that made certain officials very nervous. Marcus Coley had been a simple freighter captain once, and he had stumbled upon something ancient and terrible and wonderful all at once. The Nexus artifact had chosen him for reasons that no scientist could explain, and it had changed him into something that they, Concorde, had never seen before. For 60 years they had kept him locked away in a cell designed to contain the most dangerous beings in the known universe. And for 60 years they had studied him and tested him and tried to understand what he had become now. The humans were coming for him, and there was nothing the Concorde could do to stop them because they had never imagined that the little mammals would ever discover the truth. In her shuttle leaving the assembly hall behind forever, Ambassador Alira Voss opened a secure channel to Earth. "It is done," she said to the face of Admiral Chun that appeared on her screen. "They know we are taking Marcus, and they did not try to stop me. They will try to stop the extraction team," Admiral Chun replied, and her expression was grim. "Are we prepared for that?" "We have been preparing for 60 years," Alira said. "Ever since we learned what they did to one of our own, and we will bring him home no matter what it costs." The stars stretched past her viewport as the shuttle jumped to faster than light speed, and Alira allowed herself to hope that this gamble would pay off, because if it did not, then humanity would face the wrath of an empire that had crushed rebellions for 12,000 years. And if it did, then the Concorde would learn a lesson that they should have learned long ago. Never cage what you do not understand, and never underestimate a human. The extraction team moved through the dark corridors of Concorde Station, Omega-like shadows, and their boots made no sound on the cold metal floors. Lieutenant Commander Yuki Tanaka led the way with her weapon raised and her heart beating steady in her chest, because she had trained for this mission for 3 years, and she was not going to fail. Now behind her moved 12 of the finest soldiers that Earth had ever produced, and each one of them had volunteered for this mission, knowing that they might never return home. 30 meters to the containment sector, whispered Sergeant Okafor as he checked his scanner. "I am reading heavy security doors ahead, but no guards." "No guards?" Yuki frowned because that did not match the intelligence reports they had studied. "Where are they?" "Unknown, Commander. But the path is clear." They pressed forward and found the first security door standing open, with its lights flickering in a pattern that seemed almost random. "This feels wrong," muttered Private Chen as they passed through. Why would they leave the doors open to a maximum security prisoner? Yuki did not answer because she had no answer to give, and she simply pushed forward with her team, following close behind. The containment sector was the most heavily fortified area in the entire station, and it had been designed to hold beings that could tear through starship hulls with their bare hands. But every door they approached slid open before them, and every security system they encountered had already been disabled. When they finally reached the cell at the heart of the sector, they found a room made of metal so thick that it could withstand a direct hit from a battleship cannon. The door was sealed with 17 different locking mechanisms and covered in warning symbols in a dozen alien languages. "How do we get through this?" asked Sergeant Okafor. Yuki could respond. The locks began to click open one by one, and the massive door slowly swung inward with a thong. Groan of ancient hinges. Inside the cell sat a man. He was old now, with white hair that fell past his shoulders, and a beard that had never been trimmed, and he wore a simple gray jumpsuit that had seen better days, but his eyes were what made Yuki catch her breath, because they were not the eyes of a normal man. Stars burned in those eyes, and galaxies spun in their depths, and looking into them was like staring into the infinite void between worlds. "Took you long enough," Marcus Cole said, and his voice was rough from decades of silence, but there was humor in it too. "I was beginning to think you had forgotten about me." Yuki lowered her weapon, slowly, because she understood now why the doors had opened and why the guards had fled their posts. "Captain Cole," she said, and she was surprised at how steady her own voice sounded. "We are here to bring you home." Marcus rose to his feet, and the air around him shimmered like heat waves rising from hot sand, and the walls of his cell rippled as if they were made of water instead of reinforced. "Alloy, home," he repeated, and he said the word like a man tasting something sweet after years of bitter food. I had almost forgotten what that word meant. He took a step forward, and then another, and Yuki noticed that his feet did not quite touch the ground. As he walked, "Sir, are you able to travel?" she asked, because the mission briefing had warned them that 60 years of isolation might have damaged his mind. Marcus smiled, and it was a sad smile full of memories that Yuki could not even begin to imagine. "I have been ready to leave this place since the day they put me here," he said, "but I needed to wait for my people to come, and now here you are." They moved back through the station with Marcus walking in the center of their formation, and everywhere they went the lights flickered, and the systems glitched, and the few Concord personnel they encountered simply stopped and stared with terror in their eyes. Alarms began to wail throughout the station as someone finally realized what was happening, but it was far too late to stop. Thema squad of Varathi security officers appeared at the end of one corridor with weapons raised and shouting commands in their guttural language. Marcus raised one hand, and the weapons in the guards' hands simply stopped working as their power cells drained to nothing in an instant. "We do not need to hurt anyone," Marcus said quietly. "We are just leaving." The Varathi guards stumbled backward and fled because they had seen the files, and they knew what the prisoner was capable of, and they wanted no part of it. On the bridge of the UEF Redemption, Admiral Chun watched the extraction through the helmet cameras of the team, and she felt a chill run down her spine as she saw Marcus Cole for the first time. What in the name of all the stars did they do to him? She whispered. Dr. Amara Okonkwo stood beside her with a tablet in her hands, and her face was pale as she scrolled through the classified Concord files that their intelligence operatives had stolen. They did not do anything to him, Amara said, and her voice was barely above a whisper. They have been studying him for 60 years, trying to understand what he became after he touched the Nexus artifact. And what did he become? Amara turned the tablet to show the Admiral a diagram that made no sense to human eyes, because it depicted dimensions that humans were not meant to comprehend. The artifact was not just some ancient technology, Amara explained. It was a key and a lock and a door all at once, and according to these files, Marcus Cole is now the guardian of that door. A door to what? They do not know, and that is exactly why they were so afraid of him. The extraction team reached the docking bay, where their shuttle waited, and Marcus paused at the airlock to look back at the station that had been his prison for 6 decades. "They thought they could contain me," he said, and there was no anger in his voice, only a deep weariness. "They thought they could study me and learn my secrets and use what I had become for their own purposes. What stopped them?" Yuki asked. "I did," Marcus replied, and he turned to face her with those impossible eyes. "Every day for 60 years, I held the door closed and kept the things on the other side from coming through, and they never even knew what I was protecting them from. He stepped onto the shuttle and sat down in a seat that seemed too small for someone who contained infinity within his eyes. "Take me home, Lieutenant Commander," he said softly. "I would very much like to see Earth again before the end." Yuki did not ask what he meant by that because she was not sure she wanted to know. Shuttle lifted off and accelerated toward the waiting fleet, and behind them Concord. Station Omega went dark as every system failed at once. In the Grand Assembly Hall, an emergency session was already being called, and High Arbiter Cathal was screaming about human treachery and demanding immediate retaliation. But in the classified archives that only a handful of beings knew existed, there were files that warned of what would happen if the prisoner was ever pushed too far. Nobody had read those files in 50 years, and now it was too late. The emergency session of the Grand Assembly lasted for 14 hours, and by the end of it, the Concord had made its decision. War High Arbiter Cathal stood before the assembled delegates, and his four eyes blazed with fury as he delivered his proclamation. "The humans have stolen a Category Omega containment subject from a secure Concord facility," he roared, and his voice echoed through the vast chamber. "This is not merely theft, but an act of aggression against every species that calls the Concord home." Councillor Dreven's crystalline form pulsed with agreement, and his light had turned a deep angry red. "The little mammals have finally shown their true nature," Dreven declared. "They were never civilized, and they were never worthy of membership among us, and now they must be punished for their arrogance." The vote was unanimous, and within hours a fleet of 200 warships had been assembled from 15 different species. The largest battleships belonged to the Vorathi, and they were monsters of metal and fire that had crushed rebellions across 1,000 star systems. The fastest cruisers came from the Things, Selthari, and they could cross light years in the blink of an eye with their advanced jump drives. Smaller vessels from a dozen other species filled out the formation, and together they represented the greatest military force the galaxy had seen in 3 centuries. High Arbiter Cathal took personal command from the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Dominion, and he smiled with all 4 mouths as the fleet entered faster than light travel. "The humans think they can defy us," he said to his officers. "They think that because they have left our territory, we cannot reach them, but they are wrong. Sir, we are receiving a transmission from the human fleet," reported a young Vorathi communications officer on screen. Face of Admiral Chun appeared before them, and she looked calm and composed, despite the impossible odds she faced. "This is Admiral Chun of the United Earth Federation to the Concord Pursuit Fleet," she said. "We are transmitting a data packet containing critical information about Marcus Cole and the artifact he encountered 60 years ago. And we strongly advise you to review this information before proceeding any further." Cathal laughed, and the sound was like grinding stones. "Human arrogance knows no limits," he sneered. "Do they think to frighten us with bedtime stories and fairy tales?" "Sir, the data packet has been received," the communications officer said. "It contains what appears to be Concord research files as well as human analysis. Delete it." "But sir, it is marked as urgent, and it references the Nexus artifact and the Omega Protocol." Cathal paused for just a moment because he remembered the Nexus artifact and the chaos that had followed its discovery 6 decades ago. But then he shook his massive head. "The humans are trying to confuse us and delay our advance," he declared. "We will not fall for such obvious tricks, and we will not be intimidated by primitive mammals who think they can threaten the masters of the galaxy." But not everyone on the bridge was so confident. Science Officer Threng Kai, a young Vorathi who had only recently earned his position, stepped forward with trembling claws. "High Arbiter, if I may," he said carefully. "I have studied some of the old files about the Nexus artifact, and there were warnings in those files about what might happen if the subject was ever harmed or pushed beyond certain limits. Warnings written by cowards Cathal dismissed with a wave of his claw. The prisoner was contained for 60 years without incident, and the humans are simply trying to make us afraid of our own shadow. But sir, the file suggested that the artifact was not a weapon or a tool, but rather a seal that was created by the ancient architects to keep something contained, and the human Marcus Cole became the new guardian of that seal when he touched the artifact. A seal against what? The files did not specify, but they used words like void hunger and dimension breach, and eternal darkness. Cathal turned his 4 eyes upon the young scientist, and his gaze was cold enough to freeze stars. "You have been reading too many human fantasy stories," he said. "There is nothing beyond our dimension except emptiness, and there is nothing in this universe that the Concord cannot control." He turned back to the main view screen, where the human border was growing closer with every passing moment. All ships increased speed to maximum. He commanded, "We will reach the human colony of New Horizon within 6 hours, and we will teach these mammals what happens to those who defy the will of the Concord." Across the void of space, Admiral Chun closed the communication channel and sighed heavily. They did not listen. She said to her officers, "Did you expect them to?" Asked Captain Rodriguez, who commanded the defense fleet. "No, but I had hoped that at least one of them would have the sense to read the files before charging into a battle they cannot understand." She turned to the tactical display that showed the position of every human ship in the sector, and it was a pitiful force compared to what was coming: 37 warships and a handful of armed freighters against 200 of the most advanced vessels. "In the galaxy, we cannot win this fight," Captain Rodriguez said quietly. "Not with conventional weapons." "I know." "Then what is our plan, Admiral?" Chun looked through the viewport at the distant stars and thought about the man they had rescued from that dark cell and the things he had told her during the long journey home. "Our plan is to protect New Horizon for as long as we can," she said, "and to give the civilians time to evacuate to the shelters. And then we hope that Marcus Cole can do what he says he can do." Rodriguez stared at her for a long moment. "You are betting the lives of everyone on this planet on a man who spent 60 years in an alien prison. I am betting on a human being who has suffered more than any of us can imagine, and who still wants to protect the people who call this world home." Chun straightened her uniform and walked toward the command chair. "All ships prepare for battle," she announced over the fleet-wide channel. "Today we show the Concord what humanity is made of, and today we remind them why they should have listened when we tried to warn them." The human fleet spread out in a defensive formation around the planet, and on the surface, millions of civilians began making their way to underground bunkers. Nobody knew exactly what was coming, but everyone could feel it in their bones. Something terrible was about to happen, and the galaxy would never be the same again. The battle for New Horizon began at dawn when the first Concord ships dropped out of faster-than-light travel and filled the sky with fire. Admiral Chun watched from the bridge of the Redemption as her small fleet moved to intercept the enemy, and she knew in her heart that this was a fight they could not win. "All ships engage at will," she commanded. "Make every shot count and make them pay for every kilometer they advance." The human ships were smaller and fewer in number, but they were fast, and they were crewed by men and women who had nothing left to lose. The destroyer Valiant was the first to strike, and it dove straight toward the Varathi flagship, with all weapons blazing, and punched holes in the massive ship's shields before being torn apart by return fire. "The Valiant is gone," reported the tactical officer. "All hands lost. They took out the flagship's main sensor array before they died," Chun replied. Their sacrifice was not wasted. The battle raged across the space around New Horizon, and human ships fought with a ferocity that the Concord had never witnessed in 12,000 years of conquest. Freighters that should have fled instead rammed themselves into enemy cruisers and detonated. Their cargo holds fighters that had run out of missiles flew directly Into the engine cores of battleships and pilots, who knew they were about to die, screamed defiance over open channels. But it was not enough, because numbers still mattered, and for every Concorde ship that fell, 3 human vessels were destroyed on the surface of New Horizon. The bombardment had begun, and energy beams from orbit turned cities into craters and forests into ash in a field of golden wheat outside the capital city. A man with white hair and eyes full of stars stood alone and watched the sky burn. Marcus Cole had been standing there since the battle began, and he had not moved even as debris rained down around him and the ground shook with distant explosions. Lieutenant Commander Yuki Tanaka found him there after leading a group of civilians to the nearest shelter, and she approached him slowly because she could feel the power radiating from him like heat from a sun. "Captain Cole," she said, "you need to get to safety." "There is no safety," Marcus replied without turning around. "Not anymore. The shelters are reinforced and they can withstand orbital bombardment for at least a few hours." "Hours will not matter." Yuki stepped closer and saw that Marcus was crying, and the tears that ran down his cheeks sparkled with light that did not come from the burning sky. "What do you mean?" "They will not stop," Marcus said softly. "The Concorde will never stop because their pride will not allow them to retreat, and they will burn this world to ashes and salt the ground so that nothing ever grows here again." Above them, a massive Concorde bombardment ship moved into position directly over the capital city, and its main cannon began to charge with a glow that was visible even from the ground. "I held the door closed for 60 years. Marcus continued. "Every single day, I fought to keep it shut because I knew what was on the other side, and I knew what would happen if it ever got through." "What is on the other side?" Marcus finally turned to look at her, and Yuki felt her breath catch in her throat because his eyes were no longer just full of stars. They were full of something else now, something vast and hungry and ancient beyond comprehension. "They call themselves the Hollow Ones," Marcus said, "and they have been waiting for a very long time." The bombardment ship fired, and a beam of pure destruction lanced down toward the city where 1,000,000 people still remained. Marcus raised one hand. The beam stopped in midair and hung there like a frozen bolt of lightning, and then it simply ceased to exist as if it had never been fired at all on the bridge of the bombardment ship. The crew stared at their instruments in disbelief. "What happened?" demanded the Selthari captain, unknown. "Sir, but our main weapon has been completely drained of power." "That is impossible." "Sir, I am reading an energy signature from the planet's surface, and it is unlike anything in our databases." On the ground, Marcus lowered his hand and closed his eyes. "I tried to warn them," he said. "We all tried to warn them, but they would not listen because they thought we were nothing, and they thought I was just a curiosity to be studied and contained. You do not have to do this." Yuki pleaded because she could feel what was about to happen, even if she could not understand it. "There has to be another way." "There is no other way," Marcus replied, and his voice had become something more than human now. "I have held this door closed for 60 years, and I cannot hold it any longer." He opened his eyes, and they blazed with light that hurt to look at. "The Concorde wanted to see what I really am," he said. "Now they will see." The sky above New Horizon split open. It was not torn or broken, but simply ceased to be as a whole in reality. Itself opened where there had once been stars and clouds and blue atmosphere. Through that hole came darkness. But it was not the darkness of night or the darkness of space. It was a darkness that was alive tentacles of shadow that seemed to be made of pure absence. Reached through the breach, and each one was larger than a starship eyes that burned with colors that had no names, opened in the void, and looked down upon the Concorde fleet with hunger that had been building for eons. A sound rolled across space, and it was not heard with ears but felt in the soul, and it was a sound of joy and release and terrible appetite. The Concorde fleet froze as every ship lost power simultaneously, and beings that had ruled the galaxy for 12,000 years suddenly understood how small they truly were. The screaming began moments later. Ships were plucked from the void by shadow tentacles and crushed like insects in a child's hand. Energy beings were drained of their light until nothing remained but empty shells. The proud Vorathi warriors who had never known fear learned what terror truly meant. High Arbiter Cathal watched from his crippled flagship as his fleet was destroyed in minutes by something that should not exist. And he finally understood the warning that he had refused to read on the surface. Marcus stood in his field of wheat with tears still streaming down his face and the power of a broken seal flowing through him. "I am sorry," he whispered to no one and everyone. "I am so sorry." The door was open, and the Hollow Ones had come to feed. 17 years had passed since the sky opened above. New Horizon and the galaxy had never been the same. Galactic Concord was gone, and its great halls stood empty, and its mighty fleets had been reduced to scattered debris floating in the void. Between stars, 312 species had been members of that ancient empire, and now fewer than 200 remained with populations large enough to sustain themselves. The Hollow Ones had fed for 3 terrible days before they stopped. And in those 3 days they had consumed more life than all the wars in galactic history combined. Then, they had retreated back through the breach, and the sky had healed, and silence had fallen. Across a galaxy that was forever changed, nobody knew why the Hollow Ones had stopped, and nobody dared to guess what had satisfied their hunger enough to make them return to whatever dimension they called home. But the humans knew they knew because they had watched Marcus Cole walk into that breach on the 3rd day, and they had watched him close it from the other side. He had given his life to seal the door forever, and he had taken the key with him into the void so that it could never be opened again. Now on what had once been the capital world of the Concord, a human shuttle landed in the ruins of the Grand Assembly Hall. Former Ambassador Alira Voss stepped out onto the broken marble floor, and she was President of the United Earth Federation, now with gray in her hair and lines on her face that had not been there 17 years ago. She walked through the debris and the dust until she found what she was looking for. Counselor Dreven sat among the ruins of his species delegation platform, and his crystalline body was cracked and dim, and he looked nothing like the proud being who had once called her a little mammal. "You came," Dreven said, and his voice was barely a whisper. "You asked to see me. I wanted to understand," the ancient being said, and he raised his fractured face to look at her. "We were gods once, and we ruled this galaxy for longer than your species has existed, and you brought forth something that destroyed us in days." Alira sat down on a piece of fallen pillar and looked at the creature who had once treated her with such contempt. "We did not bring it forth," she said carefully. "Marcus contained it, and for 60 years he held that door closed while you kept him in a cage and studied him like an animal and ignored every warning we tried to give you." "Warnings?" Dreven's light flickered with confusion. "What warnings?" "We sent 17 formal communications about the Nexus artifact between the years 2847 and 2891, and every single one was classified as low priority and filed away without being reviewed." Alira pulled a data tablet from her coat and showed him the records. "We told you what Marcus was, and we told you what he was holding back, and we begged you to let us help manage the situation, but you did not listen because you did not think we were worth listening to." Dreven was silent for a long moment as the truth of her words sank into his fractured mind. The entity stopped. He finally said, "It retreated back through the breach after 3 days, and nobody understands why Marcus asked it to." Dreven looked up sharply, and his dim light flickered with disbelief. "He asked it?" "He walked through that breach, and he spoke to the Hollow Ones, and he offered them a deal," Alira explained. "His life and the permanent closure of the door in exchange for their retreat." "Why would he do such a thing?" "Because he was human, Illyra stood and brushed the dust from her coat and looked down at the broken counselor with an expression that held no anger and no satisfaction. "We protect people," she said simply, "even the ones who do not deserve it, and even the ones who cage us and mock us and dismiss us as little mammals who were never meant to sit among gods." She turned and walked a few steps toward her shuttle before pausing. "The Concorde is gone, but the United Earth Federation is offering reconstruction aid to any species that wants it with no conditions and no strings attached." Dreven stared at her back with something that might have been shock. "After everything we did to you and after everything we said about your kind, you would still help us?" "Yes." "Why?" Illyra turned to face him one last time. "Because that is what Marcus would have wanted, and because hatred and revenge would only create more suffering, and the galaxy has had enough suffering to last 1,000 lifetimes." She climbed into her shuttle and prepared to leave. But Dreven called out one final question. "Do you hate us?" Illyra considered the question carefully before answering. "I hate what you did," she admitted. "I hate that you kept a man in a cell for 60 years, and I hate that you ignored our warnings, and I hate that your arrogance cost the lives of billions." She paused, and her expression softened just slightly. "But I do not hate you. And I do not hate your people, because hate is a poison that destroys the one who carries it more than the one it is aimed at." The shuttle lifted off and flew away, and Dreven sat alone in the ruins of everything he had once believed in. For the first time in 3,000 years of life, he felt something he had never experienced before, shame far away on the world of New Horizon. A memorial stood in a field of golden wheat. It was a simple stone monument with no grand statues or elaborate carvings, and it bore only a name and a date and a single phrase: MRCUS Col 2789, 2903. He held adored humans from across the Federation made pilgrimages to this place, and they brought flowers and tokens and handwritten letters that they left. At the base of the stone, children who had been born after the breach learned the story of the man who had saved the galaxy. And parents told them that courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it, and sometimes late at night. When the stars were bright and the wheat swayed in the gentle breeze, visitors would swear they could see a figure standing in the field, a man with white hair and eyes full of stars, watching over the world he had died to protect, watching and waiting and guarding forever. The humans had left the Concorde quietly all those years ago, and nobody had thought to stop them or even to say goodbye. Now the galaxy remembered them, and would remember them for as long as stars burned in the sky, not as the little mammals who had never belonged among gods, but as the species that had given everything to save a universe that had given them nothing. That was the human way, and it always would be.